It was a calm Sunday afternoon in Peru on the 31st of May, 1970. Around 3:20 in the afternoon local time, people were going about their day. Some were relaxing after lunch, others were at church, and many in coastal towns like Chimbote and Casma were finishing their weekend chores. But without warning, the ground began to shake, hard. The shaking lasted just under 1 minute, around 45 seconds in total, but what it left behind was absolute devastation. The earthquake struck off the coast of north-central Peru about 25 kilometers west of the port city of Chimbote in the Pacific Ocean. The area where the quake started is part of a dangerous geological zone where the Nazca tectonic plate is slowly moving under the South American plate. This is what geologists call a subduction zone, and it's known for producing powerful earthquakes. On that day, the tectonic stress reached its breaking point, and the result was a massive undersea quake with a moment magnitude of 7.9. Even though the epicenter was out in the ocean, the quake's effects were felt across a massive area, roughly 83,000 square kilometers. That's an area larger than the size of Belgium and the Netherlands combined. It wasn't just Peru that felt it either. Parts of Ecuador to the north felt the tremors, and even western Brazil, deep in the Amazon, reported some shaking. From Tumbes in the north to Iquitos in the east and down past Pisco, the entire country was shaken. In Peru's capital, Lima, located over 400 miles from the epicenter, buildings swayed and people panicked. The shock even caused damage in parts of Trujillo, the third largest city in the country, although it was less severe there. The worst damage was concentrated in two regions, Ancash and southern La Libertad. These regions include the rugged Andes Mountains, as well as towns and villages along the coast. And here's the thing, this earthquake didn't just cause buildings to fall, it set off one of the most terrifying chain reactions in modern history. The power of the shaking triggered something even deadlier than the quake itself, but that part comes later. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the tremors, entire towns were left in rubble. Homes made of adobe bricks, which are common in the region, crumbled instantly. These structures aren't built to withstand strong quakes, especially on unstable soil, which many of these towns were built on. The combination was deadly. Phone lines were down, roads cracked open or were completely blocked by debris. The Pan American Highway, which runs through the region and is a major lifeline for transportation and aid, was heavily damaged. That alone would cause major problems in the hours to come, especially when it came to getting help to where it was needed most. People ran into the streets, many barefoot and still in their Sunday clothes, trying to find family members, help neighbors, or just understand what had happened. In some towns, nearly everything was flattened. In places like Carhuaz and Recuay, between 80 to 90% of buildings were destroyed. Hospitals, schools, water lines, power stations, gone. It was more than just destruction, it was complete infrastructure failure. This was not just a local emergency, it was a nationwide crisis. The Peruvian government scrambled to get information, but communication systems were barely functioning, and no one knew yet just how bad things really were in the mountain valleys to the east, especially in a place called Yungay. In the hours that followed, aftershocks rumbled through the region, keeping people on edge. The fear wasn't just about the shaking continuing, it was about what would come next. Because while the earthquake was terrible on its own, it was only the beginning of what would become the worst natural disaster in Peru's history. In the hours following the earthquake on the 31st of May, 1970, the scale of the disaster was still unclear. Communication systems were down across much of northern and central Peru, and entire towns were cut off. But as word slowly spread, it became clear that something even worse had happened in the highlands, specifically in the area near Mount Huascaran, the tallest mountain in all of Peru. Mount Huascaran stands more than 22,000 feet above sea level and is covered in glaciers year-round. When the earthquake hit, it sent powerful vibrations through the mountain's northern face. That pressure caused a massive section of rock and ice to break loose. What began as a fracture quickly turned into a roaring avalanche, one of the deadliest in human history. The falling mass of glacial ice, snow, rock, and debris formed what's known as a debris avalanche. It started high up on the mountain in a steep and heavily glaciated area. Within seconds, a wide chunk of the slope, over 900 meters across and 1.5 kilometers long, ripped free. As it tumbled downhill, it picked up speed fast. It wasn't just falling, it was racing. Estimates say it moved at more than 280 kilometers per hour and may have reached speeds over 330 kilometers per hour as it descended. By the time it neared the valley below, this avalanche had turned into a deadly wave of ice, rock, mud, and snow. It carried an estimated 80 million cubic meters of material. That's enough to fill over 30,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it was heading straight for the village of Yungay. Yungay was a peaceful town located in the Calahon-Dede Huaylas Valley. Before the earthquake, it was home to about 20,000 people. The town sat beneath Mount Huascaran's looming peak, and many residents believed the snow-covered mountain was a symbol of protection. But on that day, the mountain became the very thing that destroyed them. When the avalanche reached Yungay, it hit with such force that it buried the entire town in a matter of seconds. Homes, streets, cars, and families were all swept away. Some people tried to run, but there was almost no time. The only survivors were those who happened to be in the town's cemetery, located on a small hill that the avalanche didn't reach, and a few children who had been taken to a stadium just outside the town. Nearby, the village of Ronrahirka was also hit. It had already been partially destroyed by a previous avalanche 10 years earlier in 1960. Now it was struck again, and this time, the destruction was even worse. Entire communities vanished beneath the wave of debris. It wasn't just the physical destruction that made this avalanche so deadly. The volume of snow and rock, combined with the incredible speed and weight, meant that few structures, if any, could withstand the impact. And because the avalanche happened so quickly after the earthquake, there was no warning system, no alert, and no way for people to get to higher ground in time. In the days that followed, rescue teams struggled to reach Yungay. Roads were gone, power lines were down, and even air rescue was difficult due to poor visibility and blocked terrain. When they finally reached the site, they found what looked like a wasteland. No sign of the town, only a thick blanket of mud and rocks covering everything. The Peruvian government later declared the area where Yungay once stood a national cemetery. Digging and excavation were not allowed, both out of respect for the thousands who died and because recovery was nearly impossible. Families were left without closure. Entire generations were lost. The avalanche wasn't just a result of the earthquake, it was also a reflection of how vulnerable mountainous regions can be, especially when glaciers and unstable slopes are involved. Mount Huascaran had long been a stunning natural landmark, but that day it became the center of a disaster that would leave a permanent scar on Peru's history. As the nation tried to grasp the tragedy, attention began to shift toward the larger picture. What had happened across Ancash and La Libertad was far more than just a series of collapsed buildings. It was a complete breakdown of entire communities. Next, we'll look at the wider impact across the country, including the humanitarian crisis that followed. After the earthquake and the avalanche devastated the regions of Ancash and La Libertad on the 31st of May 1970, Peru found itself facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in its history. The destruction was so widespread that entire districts were isolated and help was slow to arrive. The country was in shock, but in the days that followed, the focus shifted toward rescue, recovery, and survival. More than 83,000 square kilometers had been affected. That's an area larger than the size of many countries, including Belgium. The destruction reached far beyond Yungay and the nearby towns. In fact, reports of damage came from as far north as Tumbes and as far south as Pisco. The tremors were felt as far east as Iquitos, deep in the jungle. Even some parts of western Brazil and southern Ecuador reported mild shaking. In the coastal city of Chimbote, which was one of the largest urban centers in the region, nearly 90% of buildings were destroyed. The port was heavily damaged and fishing operations came to a halt. Nearby cities like Casma, Arme, and Soup also saw entire blocks flattened. These were not just homes, these were schools, hospitals, government buildings, and markets. Nothing was spared. Up in the mountains, the damage was just as severe. In places like Carhuaz, Reque, and Aija, the quake wiped out nearly all infrastructure. In many areas, adobe brick homes simply crumbled. These buildings had no reinforcements and weren't built to handle seismic activity. That made them especially dangerous, and thousands of people were crushed beneath the rubble. Transportation came to a standstill. The Pan American Highway, Peru's main coastal road, was cut off in multiple locations. This slowed down aid and made it nearly impossible to reach certain towns quickly. In the Santa River Valley, the Cañon del Pardo hydroelectric plant was damaged, causing blackouts and cutting power to large parts of the region. The railway that connected Chimbote to the interior was also ruined. About 60% of that rail line became unusable overnight. By the second day, the Peruvian government began to understand how serious the situation really was. But with communication lines down and many towns still unreachable, organizing rescue efforts was incredibly difficult. Military helicopters were sent to drop food and supplies where they could, but the demand was overwhelming. Survivors were digging through rubble with their bare hands, hoping to find loved ones or recover anything that had been spared. International aid began pouring in almost immediately. Countries from around the world offered support. The United States played a major role, and First Lady Pat Nixon even traveled to Peru herself. She brought relief supplies, visited hospitals, and helped bring attention to the needs of the people affected by the disaster. Planes filled with food, medicine, blankets, and rescue equipment arrived in Lima and were transported north as quickly as possible. But even with global support, recovery was slow. The scale of the destruction made logistics a nightmare. There were not enough vehicles, fuel, or equipment to get aid where it was needed fast enough. Some towns went without help for days. People were sleeping in the open, drinking unsafe water, and struggling to find food. Diseases began to spread, especially among children and the elderly. In many places, local communities stepped up, farmers donated crops, churches opened their doors, and volunteers helped coordinate aid drops. But the trauma ran deep. Families had been wiped out, homes were gone, entire neighborhoods had simply vanished. As days turned into weeks, the country faced another painful reality: the economic cost. Estimates put the losses at more than $500 million, a devastating figure for Peru at the time. Industries shut down, jobs disappeared, and with thousands of people displaced, there was a growing need for long-term shelter and support. Despite the destruction, the people of Peru showed incredible resilience. There were acts of courage, unity, and compassion that stood out amid the devastation. Still, it was clear that recovery would take years, not months. As we wrap up, we'll explore how Peru responded in the years after the disaster, the changes made to laws, safety standards, and disaster preparedness, and how the tragedy left a lasting legacy, not just in Peru, but around the world. In the years after the Ancash earthquake of May 31st, 1970, Peru slowly began the long process of rebuilding. The disaster had not only shaken the ground, but had also exposed deep weaknesses in how the country prepared for natural catastrophes. What came next was a period of reflection, reform, and an effort to make sure a tragedy of that scale would never happen again. One of the most immediate and permanent decisions made by the Peruvian government was to preserve the site of Yungay. The town had been completely buried under millions of cubic meters of mud, rock, and ice, and recovery was impossible. The government declared the area a national cemetery. No excavation was allowed. The ruins, frozen in time, became a place of remembrance. Only a few landmarks remained above the surface, including the top of the church and a handful of palm trees. Those who had survived, mostly children who had been at the stadium on higher ground, were relocated, and the town was never rebuilt. The disaster left such a deep mark on the country that in the year 2000, Peru officially established May 31st as Natural Disaster Education and Reflection Day. On this day, schools across the country practice earthquake drills and learn about what happened in 1970. The goal is to pass on the memory of the event and to teach new generations how to react if it ever happens again. It became a part of the country's identity, an annual reminder of both loss and resilience. In terms of policy, building codes in Peru were updated. Before the earthquake, many structures had been made from adobe and lacked reinforcement. After seeing how quickly these buildings crumbled, especially in rural areas, new regulations were introduced. The government pushed for safer construction methods, especially in earthquake-prone regions. Over time, cities began replacing old infrastructure and investing in materials better able to withstand seismic activity. The tragedy also led to improvements in emergency response systems. Before 1970, there had been little coordination between military, medical, and civil services during disasters. The chaos in the days after the quake made it clear that this needed to change. The Peruvian government created new emergency management agencies, set up plans for disaster zones, and invested in training programs for search and rescue teams. Globally, the event had a lasting impact on how landslides and avalanches were studied. The Huascaran avalanche became a case study in high mountain risk zones. Scientists around the world studied what had happened in Peru, analyzing the speed and force of the debris flow that had destroyed Yungay. It helped researchers understand how rock and ice can mix to form incredibly deadly slides. This knowledge would later be used in other mountainous countries like Nepal, Pakistan, and parts of the Alps to monitor glacial areas for signs of collapse. The earthquake also pushed forward conversations about early warning systems. In 1970, Peru had no seismic warning system in place. People had no idea what was coming. Since then, countries across Latin America and around the world began investing in seismometers and alert networks. These systems are now able to detect early tremors and give people seconds or even minutes to prepare. Though Peru has faced other earthquakes since then, none have matched the sheer scale of the Ancash disaster. More than 50 years later, it remains the worst natural catastrophe in the country's history. Estimates place the number of deaths between 66,000 and 70,000 people, most of them taken not by the quake itself, but by the enormous landslide that followed. But while the physical scars of the disaster have faded in many places, the memory lives on. In Yungay, a memorial sits where the town once stood, surrounded by flowers and the rusted remains of vehicles swallowed by the avalanche. It's quiet there now. But the story of that day in 1970 continues to be told, not just in Peru, but around the world, as a reminder of nature's power and the importance of being prepared. That day changed Peru forever, and the lessons it taught are still shaping how we face disasters today. On May 12th, 2008, at precisely 2:28 p.m. local time, the Earth unleashed its fury in one of the most devastating natural disasters in modern Chinese history. A powerful earthquake struck Sichuan province in southwestern China, measuring 8.0 on the Richter scale, according to the China Earthquake Administration. The U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, recorded it as a magnitude 7.9. But regardless of the numbers, the earthquake's strength was monumental. Its epicenter was located in Sichuan County, approximately 50 miles northwest of Chengdu, the provincial capital. This rural area, surrounded by steep mountains and narrow valleys, became the epicenter of destruction. The quake was caused by the movement along the Longmanshan Fault, a tectonic plate boundary where the Indian and Eurasian plates collide. This fault zone has been geologically active for millions of years, and the immense pressure between these two plates finally gave way, resulting in the massive release of energy. The seismic event caused the ground to rupture along a fault line stretching nearly 240 kilometers, about 150 miles. In some places, the ground shifted laterally by as much as 9 meters, nearly 30 feet. The force released by this earthquake was equivalent to the detonation of multiple nuclear bombs, and its impact was felt across East Asia. What made this earthquake particularly devastating was not just its magnitude, but its shallow depth of only 19 kilometers, about 12 miles. Shallow earthquakes tend to cause more severe surface shaking, amplifying their destructive power. The tremors lasted for about 2 minutes, an eternity for those caught in its grip. It wasn't just a local event. The earthquake sent shock waves across a wide area. People as far away as Beijing, Shanghai, and even Hanoi, Vietnam, over 1,500 kilometers away, reported feeling the ground tremble. The seismic activity didn't just shake the ground, it shook the lives of millions. The towns and villages near the epicenter, including Beichuan, Yingxiu, and Dujiangyan, bore the brunt of the devastation. In Wenchuan County, where the epicenter was located, up to 80% of structures were either damaged or completely destroyed. Schools, homes, hospitals, and government buildings crumbled into heaps of rubble, trapping countless individuals beneath. Roads cracked open, bridges collapsed, and power lines snapped, plunging many areas into darkness. In the span of just a few minutes, bustling communities were reduced to ruin. The earthquake's timing added to the catastrophe. Striking in the early afternoon, many children were at school and workers were inside office buildings. Tragically, thousands of students were killed when their school buildings collapsed, exposing critical flaws in construction standards. This led to widespread anger and heartbreak among parents, who would later refer to these poorly built schools as tofu buildings due to their weak and unstable structures. Within minutes of the main quake, the region was hit by a series of aftershocks, some exceeding a magnitude of 6.0. These aftershocks not only caused additional destruction, but also made it nearly impossible for survivors to seek safety. Landslides triggered by the tremors buried entire villages, dammed rivers, and created quake lakes that pose new threats of flooding. For those who survived the initial shock, the danger was far from over. As news of the earthquake spread, a sense of dread gripped the nation. Sichuan province, known for its breathtaking natural beauty and vibrant culture, was now the epicenter of unimaginable tragedy. For the millions of people affected, life as they knew it had been irrevocably changed. The earthquake wasn't just a geological event, It was a humanitarian crisis that would require an unprecedented response. This catastrophic moment marked the beginning of a period of intense rescue and recovery efforts. But for the people of Sichuan, it was also the beginning of a long and painful journey to rebuild their lives. The Sichuan earthquake of May 12, 2008 was not a random event, but the result of complex geological forces at work over millions of years. To understand why this disaster occurred, one must delve into the tectonic processes that shaped the region and made it a hotspot for seismic activity. Sichuan province is situated near the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, one of the most geologically active regions in the world. The plateau itself was formed as a result of the collision between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, a process that began approximately 50 million years ago. This slow-motion collision continues today, with the Indian plate pushing northward at a rate of about 5 centimeters, 2 inches per year. This movement generates immense stress along fault lines in the region, particularly the Longmingshan Fault, which runs along the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau and cuts through Sichuan. The Longmingshan Fault is a thrust fault, meaning that one side of the fault is forced upward over the other due to tectonic pressure. Over time, stress builds up along the fault line until it surpasses the strength of the rock, causing the fault to rupture and release energy in the form of an earthquake. In the case of the Sichuan earthquake, the rupture occurred along a 240-kilometer, 150-mile segment of the fault, with the ground on either side shifting violently. This seismic event was classified as a megathrust earthquake, one of the most powerful types of earthquakes. These occur when a massive slab of the Earth's crust is pushed upward, releasing an enormous amount of energy. The Sichuan quake released an estimated 3 exajoules of energy, equivalent to the detonation of nearly 500 million tons of TNT. The ground shaking caused by this release of energy was intense, with peak ground accelerations exceeding 1 g-force in some areas. This level of shaking is strong enough to toss objects into the air and bring down even well-built structures. The timing of the earthquake was particularly unfortunate. It struck at 2:28 in the afternoon when many people were indoors, increasing the likelihood of fatalities and injuries. The rupture was also shallow, occurring at a depth of 19 kilometers, 12 miles. Shallow quakes tend to be far more destructive because the energy they release is concentrated close to the surface, where buildings, infrastructure, and people are located. The geology of the region also played a critical role in amplifying the quake's destructive power. The Sichuan Basin, located just east of the Tibetan Plateau, is filled with loose sedimentary layers that are prone to liquefaction during strong earthquakes. Liquefaction occurs when saturated soils lose their strength and behave like a liquid due to intense shaking. This phenomenon caused buildings to sink or tilt in many areas, further contributing to the devastation. Another factor that worsened the impact was the steep and rugged terrain surrounding the epicenter in Wenchuan County. The mountains in this region are geologically young and composed of fractured rock, making them highly susceptible to landslides during seismic events. The earthquake triggered thousands of landslides, some of which buried entire villages and blocked major rivers. These landslides created what are known as quake lakes, where debris dams rivers, forming temporary reservoirs. In some cases, these quake lakes threatened to burst, putting downstream communities at risk of catastrophic flooding. The earthquake's massive energy release and widespread destruction highlight the inherent vulnerability of the region. Despite being located in a seismically active zone, much of the area was unprepared for such a disaster. Many of the buildings that collapsed were constructed with inadequate materials and methods, unable to withstand the intense shaking. Schools in particular suffered disproportionately high levels of destruction, leading to tragic loss of life among children. In the hours immediately following the earthquake, aftershocks began to ripple through the region. These secondary quakes, some exceeding a magnitude of 6, added to the destruction and hampered rescue efforts. The strongest aftershock occurred on May 27th, measuring 6.4 in magnitude, further destabilizing the already fragile region. Over 178,000 aftershocks were recorded in the months following the main quake, a grim reminder of the ongoing geological instability. The Sichuan earthquake was a stark demonstration of the forces at play beneath the Earth's surface. It revealed the immense power of tectonic processes and the fragile balance that exists between the natural world and human settlements. For the people of Sichuan, this understanding came at a tremendous cost as the ground beneath their feet betrayed them in one of the most devastating ways imaginable. The Sichuan earthquake of May 12, 2008, brought widespread devastation, reshaping entire cities and leaving deep scars on the communities it touched. The quake's epicenter, located near Wenchuan County, saw unparalleled destruction, but its effects rippled out across Sichuan province and beyond, impacting millions of lives. Wenchuan County, home to over 100,000 people, bore the brunt of the earthquake. Entire towns were leveled within seconds as buildings collapsed under the immense forces of the quake. Public facilities, schools, and hospitals were among the hardest hit, their poorly constructed structures unable to withstand the seismic waves. In Sichuan County, another area near the epicenter, over 80% of the buildings were reduced to rubble. The picturesque town of Sichuan, nestled in a valley, was buried under landslides triggered by the quake, erasing it from the map. Larger cities like Dujiangyan, Mianyang, and Chengdu also faced significant damage. In Dujiangyan, a city known for its ancient irrigation system, modern buildings collapsed alongside historical structures. Myanmar, home to millions, saw entire residential complexes pancaked, trapping thousands of people under debris. Even Chengdu, the provincial capital located over 90 kilometers, 56 miles from the epicenter, experienced substantial destruction. Though Chengdu's modern infrastructure fared better than rural areas, older buildings, particularly in densely populated neighborhoods, suffered heavy damage. The human toll was staggering. Official records later confirmed that over 69,000 people lost their lives, but the real number may be even higher. Another 17,575 were reported missing and presumed dead. Beyond this, 374,640 people sustained injuries, many of them life-altering. In some of the hardest-hit areas, entire families were wiped out. Schools, tragically, became the sites of some of the greatest loss of life. In Sichuan Middle School, over 1,000 students and teachers perished when the building collapsed. Across Sichuan province, it is estimated that as many as 5,335 children died in their schools, sparking outrage and calls for accountability over substandard construction practices. These poorly built tofu dreg schools, so named for their fragile, crumbling materials, became symbols of the tragedy. The earthquake severely damaged critical infrastructure, isolating many towns and villages from the outside world. Roads leading to Wenchuan and other affected areas were destroyed by landslides, cutting off access for rescue teams. Bridges collapsed, including the Zipingpu Bridge near Dujiangyan, severing key transportation links. Rail lines were warped, tunnels collapsed, and highways were rendered impassable. Even the Chengdu Shuangliu International Airport experienced disruptions, further delaying relief efforts. Communication networks were also crippled, telephone lines were cut, and mobile towers toppled, leaving millions unable to contact loved ones or call for help. Electricity and water supplies were interrupted in vast swaths of the province. Hospitals, many of which were damaged or destroyed, were overwhelmed with casualties. Makeshift triage centers were set up in streets and parks, but the lack of medical supplies and personnel made it impossible to treat everyone in need. As if the earthquake itself were not enough, its aftermath brought additional hazards. Landslides triggered by the quake buried entire villages and blocked major rivers, creating a series of quake lakes. The largest of these, Tangjiashan Lake, formed when landslides blocked the Jian River near Sichuan County. The rapidly rising water levels posed a grave risk to downstream communities, with fears of catastrophic flooding. Tens of thousands of residents had to be evacuated, as engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly to drain the lake and stabilize the debris dam. The destruction of dams and reservoirs in the region added to the dangers. The Zipingpu Dam, located just a few kilometers from the epicenter, sustained significant structural damage. Had the dam failed, it could have unleashed a devastating flood, further compounding the loss of life and property. In addition to the physical devastation, the earthquake left an emotional scar on the people of Sichuan. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones in the blink of an eye. Survivors faced the daunting task of identifying bodies and saying goodbye to those they had lost, often in mass graves or hurried cremations due to health concerns. Cultural heritage sites were also affected. The ancient Dujiangyan irrigation system, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, sustained damage, though its primary structures remained intact. Temples, pagodas, and other historical landmarks crumbled, taking with them centuries of history and cultural significance. The scale of destruction shocked not only Sichuan but the entire nation. Within hours of the quake, news of the disaster spread across China, prompting an outpouring of grief and solidarity. Flags were lowered to half-mast and public events were cancelled as the nation mourned its losses. Millions tuned in to broadcasts of rescue efforts, hoping for news of survivors. The immediate aftermath of the Sichuan earthquake revealed the fragility of human life in the face of nature's fury. Cities were shattered, lives were lost, and families were torn apart, leaving a province and a nation reeling from the devastation. But amid the destruction, the resilience of the human spirit began to shine through, setting the stage for the monumental rescue and relief efforts that would follow. The aftermath of the Sichuan earthquake on May 12, 2008 revealed the immense challenges of recovery and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. As the ground stopped shaking, the true scope of the disaster came into focus, setting in motion one of the largest relief efforts in modern history. This final part examines the aftermath of the earthquake, the reconstruction efforts, the long-term impact on affected communities, and the enduring lessons learned. In the hours following the quake, China faced a monumental task: rescuing survivors, caring for the injured, and providing shelter to millions who had lost their homes. The Chinese government, recognizing the unprecedented scale of the disaster, declared a national emergency and mobilized tens of thousands of soldiers, police officers, and volunteers. Helicopters, trucks, and even makeshift rafts were employed to reach isolated areas, often navigating treacherous terrain left unstable by landslides. Time was of the essence. The first 72 hours after an earthquake are critical for rescuing those trapped under debris. Rescuers worked tirelessly, often digging with their hands or rudimentary tools, as heavy machinery could not access many remote locations. Heroic stories emerged, such as the rescue of a young girl pulled from the rubble of Sichuan Middle School after 70 hours. Yet for every life saved, there were countless others lost, their absence leaving families shattered. The disaster prompted an outpouring of support from within China and across the globe. Domestically, citizens and businesses donated money, supplies, and time. In a rare moment of unity, people from all walks of life set aside differences to contribute to the relief efforts. Telethons raised billions of yuan, while food, water, and clothing poured into Sichuan from every corner of the country. Internationally, offers of assistance came from over 100 countries and organizations. Nations such as Japan, the United States, and Russia sent rescue teams, medical personnel, and equipment. The World Health Organization and the Red Cross provided medical supplies and expertise, while the United Nations coordinated logistics to ensure aid reached those most in need. This level of international cooperation underscored the shared humanity that disasters bring to light. One of the most pressing challenges was providing shelter for the over 4 million people left homeless by the earthquake. Temporary tent cities sprang up almost overnight, dotting fields and open spaces across Sichuan. While these shelters provided immediate relief, they lacked basic amenities such as clean water, sanitation, and adequate protection from the elements. Diseases such as dysentery and respiratory infections began to spread, adding another layer of urgency to the relief efforts. The government and aid organizations worked quickly to establish more stable solutions. Prefabricated housing units were erected in large numbers, providing a semblance of normalcy for displaced families. Schools and clinics were set up within these settlements, ensuring children could continue their education and medical needs could be addressed. However, the psychological scars of the disaster were harder to mend. Counseling services were introduced, focusing on children who had witnessed the loss of friends, teachers, and family members. The scale of destruction required a comprehensive, long-term approach to rebuilding. In September 2008, the Chinese government unveiled a massive reconstruction plan with a budget of over 1 trillion yuan, equivalent to approximately $146 billion at the time. The plan aimed to rebuild homes, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure with an emphasis on safety and sustainability. One of the most ambitious projects was the relocation of entire towns. For instance, the devastated town of Sichuan was rebuilt on a new site several kilometers away, with modern earthquake-resistant structures. The old town was preserved as a memorial, a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the power of nature. Other towns and villages were similarly relocated or rebuilt with improved designs to minimize future risks. In addition to physical reconstruction, the government prioritized economic recovery. Subsidies were provided to farmers to replace lost livestock and replant crops, while small businesses received financial assistance to restart operations. Larger industries, such as manufacturing and tourism, were incentivized to invest in the region, creating jobs and stimulating the local economy. The earthquake left deep emotional scars on survivors, many of whom lost multiple family members. The grieving process was compounded by the sheer scale of the disaster, with entire communities mourning their dead. In response, memorials and monuments were erected across Sichuan. Annual commemorations on May 12th serve as both a remembrance of those who perished and a testament to the resilience of the survivors. In Sichuan, the remains of the old town were turned into a national earthquake memorial site, drawing visitors from around the world. Schools, such as Juyuan Middle School, where hundreds of students lost their lives, became places of pilgrimage, with flowers, photos, and messages left in tribute to the young lives cut short. The Sichuan earthquake exposed weaknesses in building codes and disaster preparedness, prompting significant reforms. Stricter construction standards were implemented nationwide, with an emphasis on ensuring schools, hospitals, and other public buildings could withstand future earthquakes. Emergency response protocols were also overhauled, with greater investment in training, equipment, and public awareness campaigns. The disaster also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in addressing large-scale emergencies. China's openness to foreign assistance during the crisis marked a significant shift in its approach to humanitarian aid, fostering closer ties with global partners. The Sichuan earthquake was one of the most devastating natural disasters in China's history, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit, from the heroic efforts of rescuers to the generosity of strangers. The response to the disaster showcased humanity at its best. While the scars of the earthquake remain, the people of Sichuan have rebuilt their lives and communities with determination and hope. The legacy of the earthquake is a reminder of both the fragility of life and the strength that emerges in the face of adversity. For those who lived through it, May 12, 2008, will forever be a day of sorrow and remembrance, but also a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring bonds of humanity. In the early morning hours of April 28th in the year 1903, the earth under the town of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey began to shake violently. It was sudden, intense, and completely unexpected. A powerful earthquake struck the region, reaching a surface wave magnitude of 7.0. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Manzikert, which today lies in Mus province, sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The ground beneath eastern Turkey is under constant pressure because it lies along the boundaries of major tectonic plates. The Arabian plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate from the south, while the Anatolian plate, which holds most of Turkey, is being squeezed and pushed westward. This collision zone has produced earthquakes for thousands of years and still does today. Back in 1903, there were no early warning systems. People had no way to prepare for what was coming. The shaking began without warning, and within minutes, homes, buildings, and entire neighborhoods had crumbled. The earthquake caused massive destruction across the region. 12,000 homes were completely destroyed. Not damaged, gone, flattened. For people living in rural villages with simple stone or mud brick homes, there was no protection when the earth turned violent. The shaking was so strong that the ground split in places, and landslides were triggered in nearby hills. Thousands of animals, over 20,000, died, many crushed in collapsed barns or caught in the chaos that followed. For a region that relied heavily on agriculture and livestock to survive, losing that many animals was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of livelihood. But the most heartbreaking toll was the human one. An estimated 3,500 people were killed in the disaster. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors were left digging through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for anyone who might still be alive. The sound of weeping and shouting filled the air in the hours after the shaking stopped. Nearby cities and towns like Erzurum and Bitlis felt the earthquake too. Though the damage there was less severe, buildings cracked and panic spread. Roads and trails used for travel became blocked by debris, making rescue efforts even harder. And because this was the early 20th century, there were no helicopters, no quick emergency teams. Help came slowly, by foot, by cart, or not at all. The people of Manzikert had no choice but to rely on each other. Neighbors helped neighbors, even while grieving their own losses. Makeshift shelters were set up using whatever materials could be found. Fires were lit to keep warm at night, as many were forced to sleep outside in the cold. The strong aftershocks kept coming, making it impossible for people to feel safe indoors. This earthquake would go on to be remembered as one of the deadliest in Turkish history. But it was only the beginning of the hardship. The full impact of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would be felt for years to come. As the days passed after the earthquake struck Manzikert, the damage began to reveal itself even more clearly. Survivors who had crawled out from collapsed homes began walking through their villages, seeing entire streets reduced to rubble. Stone walls had collapsed inward, roofs had caved in, and the narrow dirt roads were blocked with debris. In many places, there was nothing left standing. The landscape looked as though it had been torn apart by war. Relief was slow to arrive. In the early 1900s, the region was isolated. With limited infrastructure, there were no paved highways or motor vehicles. The only ways to reach Manzikert were by foot, horseback, or donkey carts, and the trails were damaged or blocked by landslides. News of the earthquake spread slowly. Weeks went by before help from distant cities began to trickle in. In the meantime, the survivors had to rely entirely on local resources. Many had lost everything. Families were now homeless, living in temporary shelters made from wooden planks and canvas, or huddling in caves and open fields. With their livestock gone and food supplies buried under rubble, hunger and illness started to take hold. Clean water was scarce, and without proper sanitation, diseases quickly began to spread. It was no longer just an earthquake disaster, it was now a humanitarian crisis. The psychological toll on the survivors was heavy. Every aftershock brought fresh fear. People were afraid to sleep indoors, even in buildings that were still standing. Children cried at the sound of the ground rumbling, and adults kept one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that signaled a new collapse or landslide. Entire communities were gripped by fear and uncertainty. Beyond Manzikert, the earthquake was felt across much of eastern Anatolia. In cities like Erzurum and Bitlis, the shaking caused damage to important structures. Mosques, markets, and schools showed signs of cracking, and some smaller buildings collapsed. Though the destruction was not as complete as in Manzikert, it served as a reminder of just how far-reaching the earthquake had been. Even regions not directly in the epicenter were affected economically and emotionally. In the countryside surrounding Manzikert, farmers were devastated. The land had shifted, irrigation systems were damaged or destroyed, fields were torn apart, and in some areas, the soil had been displaced so badly that planting crops was no longer possible. Entire growing seasons were lost. Combined with the deaths of 20,000 animals, it meant that famine was now a looming threat. The Ottoman authorities at the time did what they could, but the response was limited. There was no central disaster agency, no stockpile of supplies, no formal rescue teams. Aid depended heavily on local governors, religious leaders, and community volunteers. Donations were sent from neighboring provinces, and religious institutions helped organize relief, but resources were stretched thin. The disaster exposed the vulnerability of rural communities in eastern Turkey. Most homes had been built from sun-dried bricks or local stones, materials that stood no chance against a major quake. The collapse of these homes wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a sign of how unprepared the region was for a natural disaster of this size. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manzikert began the slow process of digging out what they could. Personal belongings were retrieved from the ruins, but for many there was little to find. Entire family histories, photos, books, heirlooms had been buried or burned. Yet amid the loss, there were small moments of hope. People who had been presumed dead were found alive. Buried under beams or inside pockets of collapsed rooms, rescued by neighbors who refused to give up searching. The memory of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would remain etched in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. But this was only the early phase of a much longer journey. Recovery would take years, and the scars left by the earthquake, both physical and emotional, would run deep. Months after the earthquake, the people of Manzikert were still struggling to return to anything close to normal. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it new challenges. With so many buildings destroyed and clean water supplies either buried or contaminated, sanitation had become a serious problem. Flies gathered around waste and rotting animal carcasses that had not been properly buried. Sickness was spreading rapidly. Typhoid and dysentery were common. With limited medical knowledge and no modern hospitals nearby, even treatable illnesses became deadly. The destruction of homes and livestock had left thousands of people dependent on whatever help they could get. Food shortages were growing worse. Crops planted earlier in the spring had withered in fields, that could no longer be properly irrigated. Entire harvests had failed. Families were now relying on donated grains, dried fruits, and whatever animals they had managed to save. The loss of 20,000 animals was not just a number, it meant fewer plows, no milk, no transportation, and no meat for entire communities. Despite the devastation, some rebuilding efforts had started. Using what materials they could find, wood, salvaged bricks, mud, people began putting up temporary homes. These makeshift shelters offered little protection against the weather, but they were a sign that the town was not giving up. Stonemasons and laborers came from neighboring villages to help, even though many of them had suffered losses themselves. In the absence of formal engineering knowledge, homes were rebuilt in much the same way they had been before, leaving them just as vulnerable to future quakes. Religious leaders played a big role during this time. Mosques that had survived the shaking became gathering places not only for worship, but for organizing food distribution and community decisions. Clerics gave sermons focused on strength and perseverance, and many people found comfort and faith when there was little else to hold onto. Beyond the town itself, the government had begun taking notes. The Ottoman Empire, still in its final decades, was under pressure from multiple sides, financially, politically, and militarily. Natural disasters like the Manzikert quake only added more stress. Officials sent reports back to Istanbul detailing the destruction, and engineers were dispatched to evaluate the damage. While resources were limited, the disaster helped push the discussion about earthquake risks into broader political conversations. Meanwhile, researchers of the time began paying closer attention to the geology of the region. Though modern seismology was still in its infancy, it was becoming clear that eastern Anatolia was resting on unstable ground. Scientists noted that the region was close to the junction between two major fault systems, the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. These faults were now being studied more closely, and there were early theories forming about the movement of plates and how stress in the Earth's crust could build over time until it suddenly released in a violent quake. In addition to the main earthquake in April, there were multiple aftershocks over the following weeks and months. One of the more powerful ones struck on the 6th of August, causing new damage to buildings that had survived the initial quake. Some people who had started rebuilding saw their homes collapse again. A few were injured, and the fear that had briefly started to fade came roaring back. Many residents began questioning whether it was even safe to remain in the region. Despite the suffering, people found ways to survive. Communities worked together, sharing tools, food, and even space. Entire families moved in together under single roofs. Children played in the dust and rubble, finding moments of laughter amid the hardship. Weddings were still held, funerals still observed, and markets slowly reopened. Bit by bit, life was continuing, even if it looked completely different than before. For the people of Manzikert, the earthquake had not just destroyed buildings, it had changed the rhythm of their lives, shifted their priorities, and forced them to rethink how they would live in a land that could shake without warning. But they kept going, one day at a time, trying to rebuild not just their homes, but the future. In the years that followed the 1903 Manzikert earthquake, the tragedy stayed fresh in people's memories. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and lost. Family members buried under collapsed roofs, animals crushed in barns, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The ground beneath their feet had once felt solid, dependable. Now every tremor, every creak of a shifting house beam sparked a fear that was hard to forget. Across the region, this earthquake became one of the key moments that helped shift how people understood natural disasters. Before then, earthquakes were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment, unpredictable and unavoidable. But the scale of the Manzikert disaster forced people to ask new questions. Could something like this happen again? Was it possible to prepare or even to prevent such destruction? At the time, formal earthquake science was still very limited, especially in eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire. There were no warning systems, no emergency response plans, and little public understanding of how earthquakes worked. But slowly that began to change. Scholars and engineers began paying more attention to the fault lines running through the Anatolian region. Reports were written, diagrams drawn, and early versions of risk maps were developed by experts in Istanbul and abroad. The Ottoman government, though strained and declining, did begin to gather more earthquake data. They compiled damage reports from towns like Manzikert, Erzurum, and Bitlis. These records would later help future researchers understand which parts of the country were most at risk. The memory of the 1903 disaster also started conversations about the need for safer buildings. though large-scale changes in construction would not fully come into place until decades later. Even without modern engineering, local builders and masons began to change their methods. In the years after the quake, new homes were often made shorter with thicker walls and stronger support beams. People experimented with new materials when they could get them, hoping to avoid the same total collapse if another quake hit. Though these improvements were small, they marked the start of a long journey toward earthquake-resistant design. The disaster also left behind lessons in human resilience. Communities that had been torn apart slowly rebuilt themselves. Fields were planted again. Children born after the quake grew up hearing stories of survival and loss. Local traditions of sharing and mutual aid grew stronger. In some villages, neighbors formed informal watch groups that kept an eye out for signs of danger, shifting rocks, strange animal behavior, or unusual ground movement. Manzikert itself never forgot what happened. For decades, the earthquake remained part of its identity. Stories were passed down from elders to children, describing the moment the earth cracked open and the dust swallowed everything. The quake had reshaped more than just the land. It had changed the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Across Turkey, the Manzikert quake is now remembered as one of the earliest major disasters of the 20th century. It helped lay the groundwork for future efforts in earthquake preparedness, though progress would take many years. By the end of the 20th century, more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had struck the country, killing more than 100,000 people and injuring many more. Each one added new urgency to the call for safety and preparedness. And today, Turkey has modern seismology centers, early warning systems, and strict building codes in many regions. These advances were not born overnight. They came from decades of hard lessons, of loss and recovery. And the 1903 Manzikert earthquake was one of the earliest and most painful lessons of all. The scars left behind by that earthquake are no longer visible in rubble, but they remain in the country's memory. They remind us of the quiet danger that lives beneath our feet and the strength that people can find when everything falls apart. The Great Hanshin earthquake, also known as the Kobe earthquake, struck Japan on January 17, 1995, with a magnitude of 6.9. It remains one of the deadliest and most devastating earthquakes in Japan's history. This earthquake hit the region around the city of Kobe, located in the Hyogo prefecture. The earthquake's epicenter was located just off the coast, in the northern part of the Seto Inland Sea, and its impact was felt all across the region, affecting millions of people. The timing of the earthquake could not have been worse. It struck at precisely 5:46 a.m., while most people were still asleep in their homes. The suddenness of the tremor caught many off guard. In just a few moments, the city was shaken to its core and the damage was immediate. Buildings collapsed, roads cracked, and bridges crumbled. The chaos of that morning was overwhelming, with no time for warning or preparation. Kobe, a major port city and one of Japan's most important economic hubs, was severely affected. Its infrastructure was completely devastated, making rescue and recovery operations incredibly difficult. The earthquake caused fires to break out across the city, further hindering efforts to save those trapped under rubble. Many of the older buildings in Kobe, which were not designed to withstand such a powerful quake, were reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, newer, supposedly safer buildings fared better, but even they were not immune to the massive shaking. More than 6,000 people lost their lives that morning, and thousands more were injured. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, leaving thousands of residents homeless. In addition to the loss of life, the economic toll was staggering. Kobe's port, a vital part of the local economy, was closed due to the destruction, and businesses were forced to shut down as the city struggled to recover from the disaster. In the days and weeks following the earthquake, the scale of the disaster became clearer. The people of Kobe faced a long and grueling recovery process. Roads, bridges, and railways had been damaged beyond recognition, and the lack of communication only made it more difficult for emergency responders to reach the hardest hit areas. The rescue teams were overwhelmed, and the government was unprepared for such a large-scale disaster. In the aftermath of the earthquake, Japan began to reassess its earthquake preparedness systems. While the country had long been aware of the seismic activity in the region, the Great Hanshin earthquake exposed the limitations of Japan's infrastructure and response systems. The earthquake was a wake-up call for the nation and the world, showing just how vulnerable even the most advanced cities could be in the face of a major natural disaster. The aftermath of the Great Hanshin earthquake was a time of immense hardship for the people of Kobe and the surrounding areas. The destruction was not just physical, but emotional as well. In addition to the loss of life, the earthquake shattered the lives of countless individuals who were left without homes, businesses, or even basic services. Many survivors found themselves struggling to find food, clean water, and medical supplies as the city's infrastructure had collapsed. Hospitals, schools, and other essential buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged, making it difficult for the city to provide even the most basic services to its residents. As the days passed, the government and local authorities began to mobilize rescue and relief efforts. Emergency teams from across Japan and around the world rushed to the affected areas to search for survivors, but the scale of the disaster was so vast that it took days, even weeks, before help could reach some of the most devastated neighborhoods. The most affected areas were the older parts of the city, where buildings had not been built to withstand an earthquake of such magnitude. In these areas, entire blocks of homes and businesses were reduced to rubble, trapping people under collapsed structures. One of the major challenges was the lack of accessible roads and transportation. With bridges and highways destroyed, rescue teams had to find alternative routes to reach those in need. This slowed down efforts to rescue survivors and deliver critical aid. The scale of the damage also made it difficult for emergency teams to communicate and coordinate their efforts. For days, many parts of the city were completely cut off from the outside world. The earthquake also caused fires that ravaged large portions of the city. Many of these fires broke out in the immediate aftermath of the quake, fueled by broken gas lines and damaged electrical wiring. The fire crews were unable to reach all of the fires due to the damage to the roads and the overwhelming number of other emergencies. As a result, entire neighborhoods burned for hours, adding to the destruction and further complicating the recovery efforts. In addition to the physical damage, the psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Many had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods. The trauma of experiencing the earthquake and its aftermath lingered for years, with many people struggling with feelings of grief, anxiety, and fear. In the days and weeks that followed, support services began to be set up to help the survivors cope with the emotional and psychological effects of the disaster. As the immediate shock of the earthquake began to wear off, the long-term impact on Kobe and the surrounding areas became clearer. The damage was not just to the buildings and infrastructure, but to the very heart of the city. Kobe's economy, which had relied heavily on its port and industrial sectors, was devastated. Many businesses were forced to close and unemployment rates soared. The city's economy would take years to fully recover, and the effects of the earthquake were felt across the entire country. The earthquake also raised important questions about the way Japan and other countries approach disaster preparedness. The devastation caused by the Great Hanshin earthquake highlighted the need for more resilient infrastructure, better communication systems, and more efficient disaster response plans. Japan, known for its advanced technology and infrastructure, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster, prompting a nationwide reevaluation of how to prepare for future earthquakes and other natural disasters. In the wake of the tragedy, Japan committed to rebuilding and improving its disaster preparedness systems. The lessons learned from the Great Hanshin earthquake led to changes in building codes, emergency response procedures, and public education about earthquake safety. The tragedy, while devastating, also served as a catalyst for change, ensuring that Japan would be better equipped to face future disasters. As the dust settled in the wake of the Great Hanshin earthquake, the focus shifted from rescue to recovery and rebuilding. The immense scale of the damage in Kobe and its surrounding areas meant that the recovery process would take years, not just months. The earthquake had severely impacted the city's infrastructure, and the efforts to rebuild it were daunting. The sheer magnitude of the destruction left the government and local authorities scrambling to find the resources needed to reconstruct roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and homes. One of the biggest challenges was the rebuilding of the city's transportation network. With roads and highways destroyed, there was a critical need to restore vital links between Kobe and the rest of Japan. Reconstruction efforts had to balance speed with safety, ensuring that the new infrastructure could withstand future earthquakes. The city's port, a crucial part of its economy, was heavily damaged. With Kobe being one of Japan's busiest ports, the closure of the port for months created a ripple effect throughout the country, impacting trade and supply chains. The task of restoring the port to full capacity was a monumental one, requiring new facilities and the relocation of cargo operations to other areas until the port was fully rebuilt. During the reconstruction, the focus was also on strengthening the city's infrastructure to ensure it would be better prepared for future earthquakes. Japan's government introduced stricter building codes and regulations, demanding that new construction projects and repairs be more resilient to seismic activity. This involved using advanced engineering techniques to reinforce buildings and structures, incorporating new materials that could absorb shock and prevent collapse. Many buildings that were originally constructed with insufficient earthquake-resistant designs were retrofitted to meet these new standards. The goal was to make Kobe and other cities more resilient to earthquakes, reducing the loss of life and property in future events. As rebuilding efforts continued, the emotional and psychological recovery was just as critical. Thousands of survivors had lost family members, homes, and businesses, leaving them grappling with feelings of loss and trauma. The community faced not only the physical challenge of rebuilding, but also the emotional task of coming to terms with the devastation. Local support networks, including counseling services, were established to help individuals cope with the trauma. Many survivors found comfort in rebuilding their communities, forming tight-knit groups that worked together to restore their neighborhoods. This sense of unity and collective strength became a cornerstone of the recovery process. The Great Hanshin earthquake also prompted the Japanese government and experts to reevaluate their disaster preparedness systems. The lessons learned from this disaster were invaluable, leading to the development of more advanced early warning systems, improved disaster response protocols, and a greater focus on community involvement in preparedness efforts. Japan's government took the opportunity to make significant changes in how the country would handle natural disasters in the future. New technologies and systems for predicting earthquakes were implemented, including advanced seismic monitoring equipment and systems to warn the public of impending earthquakes. While no technology could ever fully eliminate the risk of an earthquake, the goal was to minimize the damage and loss of life when disaster struck. Internationally, the aftermath of the Great Hanshin earthquake was seen as a wake-up call for countries around the world, especially those located in earthquake-prone areas. Many nations looked to Japan's recovery efforts as a model for how to rebuild after a natural disaster and improve their own disaster preparedness systems. The outpouring of support from countries around the world, as well as international relief efforts, highlighted the importance of global cooperation in the face of catastrophe. The recovery from the Great Hanshin earthquake was not just about rebuilding physical structures, it was about restoring hope and resilience. The people of Kobe, and Japan as a whole, showed an incredible spirit in the face of devastation. Through years of hard work, determination, and a collective commitment to rebuilding, Kobe was able to emerge from the ruins stronger and more prepared for the future. The earthquake, while tragic, ultimately led to profound changes that shaped Japan's approach to disaster preparedness and recovery, making the country better equipped to face the challenges posed by natural disasters in the years to come. In the years following the Great Hanshin earthquake, the long and difficult process of rebuilding continued to unfold, but the impact of the disaster lingered in ways that went beyond physical structures. The trauma experienced by the people of Kobe and the surrounding areas, as well as the lessons learned during the recovery, reshaped not only the city but Japan as a whole. The earthquake served as a catalyst for significant changes in disaster preparedness, urban planning, and the way the country viewed its vulnerability to natural disasters. One of the major shifts that occurred after the earthquake was a more community-centered approach to disaster preparedness. Prior to the Great Hanshin earthquake, Japan had focused heavily on large-scale government response systems. While these systems were important, the events of January 17, 1995, revealed how critical it was for local communities to be actively involved in disaster preparedness. In Kobe, as residents worked together to rebuild their neighborhoods, they developed close-knit networks that could respond more effectively in future emergencies. These local efforts became a model for other parts of Japan, encouraging a greater focus on community-based disaster education and planning. The lessons learned during the recovery process demonstrated that effective disaster response wasn't just about having government resources at the ready, it was about having a well-informed and prepared public. The devastation caused by the earthquake also accelerated technological advancements in Japan's earthquake detection and early warning systems. Prior to 1995, Japan had some of the most advanced seismic monitoring equipment in the world, but the scale of the disaster revealed room for improvement. After the earthquake, the Japanese government invested heavily in expanding and enhancing its earthquake monitoring networks. This included the introduction of more sensitive sensors capable of detecting tremors and predicting earthquakes with greater accuracy. These advancements have saved countless lives in the years since, with early warning systems now alerting people of impending quakes seconds before they hit, providing just enough time to take cover or evacuate. These efforts highlighted the importance of using technology not only for recovery, but for prevention, mitigation, and survival. In addition to technological advancements, there was also a major rethinking of Japan's building standards and urban planning. Following the earthquake, Japan implemented stricter building codes, ensuring that future construction projects would be able to withstand more severe seismic activity. Many buildings throughout Kobe, as well as in other parts of Japan, were retrofitted to meet these new standards. The goal was to make structures more resistant to earthquakes, reducing the risk of collapse and minimizing damage. In cities like Kobe, which are built on hilly terrain and are densely populated, this was especially important. The lessons learned from the earthquake led to the development of earthquake-resistant technologies, such as shock absorbers and flexible foundations, which are now used in buildings across Japan and around the world. Furthermore, the recovery process highlighted the need for better emergency response coordination between local, regional, and national governments. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, there was confusion and inefficiency in the way rescue efforts were carried out. Different agencies and organizations were not always working in sync, and there were significant delays in providing aid to those who needed it most. This was due in part to the sheer scale of the disaster and the difficulty of navigating through the debris-strewn streets. In the years that followed, Japan worked to improve its disaster response systems, establishing clearer lines of communication and coordination. This resulted in faster, more efficient responses during subsequent natural disasters, such as the Great East Japan Earthquake in 2011. The Great Hanshin Earthquake also had a lasting impact on Japan's culture, especially when it came to how the public viewed natural disasters. Prior to the earthquake, many people in Japan, while aware of the country's seismic risks, may not have fully understood the scale of potential destruction. The earthquake of 1995 shattered that sense of complacency, and for many it was a wake-up call. People began to see earthquakes not as isolated events, but as a constant threat that could strike at any moment. This shift in perspective led to an increased demand for disaster preparedness and education. School children across Japan started to undergo more rigorous earthquake drills, and citizens were encouraged to develop emergency kits and evacuation plans. The earthquake's impact also rippled through the international community. The global response to the disaster was overwhelming, with countries from all over the world sending aid, supplies, and rescue teams. The outpouring of support demonstrated the power of global solidarity in the face of natural disasters. In addition, the Great Hanshin earthquake led to an increase in international collaboration on disaster preparedness and response. Japan, known for its technological advancements and expertise in seismic activity, shared its knowledge with other nations, helping them better prepare for their own natural disasters. The lessons learned from Kobe continue to influence disaster response strategies around the world. As time passed, Kobe's recovery was marked by remarkable resilience. The city slowly but surely rebuilt itself, not just physically but socially and culturally. The community became stronger, and the people of Kobe, having faced one of the most devastating earthquakes in Japan's history, found new ways to come together in the face of adversity. The memories of that tragic day still live on, but so too does the indomitable spirit of the people who rose from the rubble to rebuild their city and their lives. The legacy of the Great Hanshin earthquake is one of transformation, a powerful reminder of the importance of preparedness, community, and resilience in the face of disaster. The Great Hanshin earthquake, which struck on January 17, 1995, left an indelible mark on Japan, both in terms of the physical devastation it caused and the deep emotional scars it left behind. As we look back on the events of that day and the aftermath, it becomes clear that the earthquake, while one of the most tragic moments in Japanese history, also led to profound changes in the way the country prepares for and responds to natural disasters. The loss of over 6,000 lives and the widespread destruction caused by the earthquake transformed not just Kobe, but Japan as a whole, reshaping its approach to urban planning, disaster response, and community resilience. In the years that followed, the people of Kobe and the surrounding areas found the strength to rebuild. The scars left by the earthquake are still visible in some parts of the city, but the determination of its residents has transformed the city into a symbol of resilience and recovery. The disaster prompted a complete rethinking of how Japan would handle future seismic events. While the country had always been aware Of the risks posed by earthquakes, the scale and ferocity of the Great Hanshin earthquake served as a wake-up call that no level of preparedness could fully prepare a nation for such a devastating event. But in the face of this tragedy, Japan's response evolved in ways that would shape disaster management for years to come. The legacy of the Great Hanshin earthquake is not just about the physical reconstruction of buildings or the development of advanced earthquake warning systems. It's about the lessons learned from the disaster and the ways in which those lessons have shaped the culture of preparedness and the collective memory of the nation. In many ways, the earthquake brought Japan closer together, uniting its citizens in a shared commitment to ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to face the challenges of living in one of the most seismically active regions of the world. It also served as a powerful reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the need for constant vigilance and preparation. Today, Japan stands as a global leader in disaster preparedness, with advanced technology, strict building codes, and a population well-versed in emergency procedures. The Great Hanshin earthquake played a crucial role in shaping this preparedness culture, with its lessons influencing not only Japan's approach to earthquakes, but also its response to other natural disasters. The resilience demonstrated by the people of Kobe has become a beacon of hope for other regions affected by similar catastrophes, offering a model for how communities can recover and rebuild in the face of unimaginable loss. As we reflect on the events of January 17, 1995, we are reminded of the power of human resilience. The tragedy of the Great Hanshin earthquake may have caused immense pain and suffering, but it also highlighted the strength of the human spirit. The survivors, the first responders, and the people of Kobe who came together to rebuild their city showed the world what it means to persevere in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a story of tragedy, yes, but also one of hope, unity, and the unwavering will to rebuild after disaster strikes. In closing, the Great Hanshin earthquake serves as a reminder of how fragile life can be and how important it is to be prepared for the unexpected. While we cannot predict when or where the next disaster will strike, we can take the lessons from past events and use them to strengthen our own communities. The disaster's impact continues to be felt, but the recovery process stands as a testament to the resilience and determination of the people of Kobe and Japan. This is a story that will continue to be told for generations, not just as a historical event, but as a lasting reminder of the power of human spirit in the face of disaster. In the mid-18th century, Lisbon was a thriving city, often described as one of the most prosperous in Europe. The year was 1755, and Lisbon was not just the capital of Portugal, but a bustling hub of trade and cultural exchange. With its strategic location along the Atlantic Ocean, it was an essential port for trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ships filled with goods from distant lands regularly docked in its harbor. Contributing to the city's wealth and influence, Lisbon's streets were lined with beautiful architecture, showcasing its role as a major cultural center. Grand palaces, churches, and squares adorned the city, making it a symbol of European elegance and power. The city's prominence was further solidified by its vibrant cultural scene, which included a flourishing arts community, theaters, and universities. Lisbon, in many ways, represented the peak of European civilization at the time. On the 1st of November, 1755, the city was preparing for the celebration of All Saints' Day, a day filled with religious observance, festivities, and joy. Little did the people of Lisbon know, this day of celebration would soon turn into one of unimaginable devastation. The peaceful city, known for its riches and architectural beauty, was about to experience an event that would change its course forever. The ground beneath Lisbon would soon tremble in a way no one could have predicted, marking the beginning of a disaster that would go down in history as one of the deadliest earthquakes ever recorded. At precisely around 9 a.m. on the 1st of November, 1755, the ground beneath Lisbon began to shake violently. The earthquake, estimated to have a magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0 on the Richter scale, struck with a force that no one could have anticipated. The tremors lasted for several minutes, but in that short amount of time, the destruction was immense. Buildings that had once been symbols of the city's wealth and culture crumbled to the ground, while the ground itself split open in some areas, swallowing everything in its path. As the city's structures collapsed, fires erupted across Lisbon. The tremors had severed gas lines and caused sparks from broken electrical wires, igniting countless fires that raged through the city. With many of the city's water sources disrupted by the earthquake, efforts to contain the fires were futile. The flames consumed what the earthquake hadn't already destroyed. But the disaster didn't end there. Just hours after the earthquake struck, the ocean itself seemed to turn against the city. A massive tsunami, triggered by the seismic activity beneath the ocean floor, slammed into the coast of Lisbon. Waves as high as 20 meters, approximately 65 feet, crashed into the city, sweeping away entire neighborhoods. The tsunami added another layer of devastation, drowning people who had survived the earthquake and leaving the city's waterfront completely destroyed. The death toll from the disaster was catastrophic, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to 100,000 people. Many lives were lost in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, while others perished from the fires that continued to ravage the city. Lisbon, once a bustling and vibrant metropolis, was reduced to rubble in just a few hours. The earthquake had transformed the city into a desolate wasteland, and the world would never forget the sheer power of nature that had been unleashed on that fateful day. In the wake of the devastation caused by the earthquake, Lisbon and the rest of the world were left in shock. The disaster not only destroyed the city, but also shook the very foundations of people's beliefs and perceptions of the world. For centuries, religious explanations had provided a framework for understanding natural disasters, and many believed that such catastrophic events were divine punishments for human sins. The tragedy of the Lisbon earthquake, however, led to a profound philosophical shift in how people viewed the forces of nature and their relationship with the divine. Many religious leaders at the time struggled to provide comforting answers to the people of Lisbon, as they had no explanation for why such a horrible event could happen to a city known for its devotion. This lack of answers sparked intense debate across Europe, as people began to question the traditional religious interpretations of disasters like earthquakes. The Lisbon earthquake forced individuals to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, morality, and the nature of divine will. At the same time, the earthquake also played a significant role in the rise of Enlightenment thinking, which was sweeping across Europe during the late 1700s. Philosophers like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau began to challenge the established religious order and question the very idea of divine punishment. They argued that natural disasters were not the result of divine wrath, but rather the result of natural forces that could be understood through science and reason. In his famous poem, Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne, Voltaire criticized the idea that such an event was caused by divine intervention, instead suggesting that earthquakes were simply a result of natural processes that needed to be studied and understood. This shift in thinking marked a turning point in how natural disasters were perceived and set the stage for the development of modern scientific explanations for earthquakes and other catastrophic events. The earthquake of 1755 had inadvertently sparked a new era of intellectual inquiry, where the idea of divine providence began to give way to rational, scientific explanations. It was a crossroads in history, where the traditional religious worldview was increasingly challenged by the emerging ideas of the Enlightenment, forever altering how people would view natural disasters and the world around them. In the aftermath of the devastation caused by the Lisbon earthquake, the city was left in ruins. Amidst the destruction, a remarkable story of resilience and rebuilding began. The task of restoring the city fell to Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis de Pombal, who was appointed by King José I to lead the reconstruction efforts. Pombal, a visionary reformer, quickly set to work, determined to not only rebuild Lisbon but to create a more modern, safer city that would be better prepared for future disasters. Under Pombal's leadership, the city's reconstruction was approached with a focus on efficiency, practicality, and most importantly, safety. One of the major innovations during this time was the creation of new building codes designed to make structures more resistant to earthquakes. These codes mandated that buildings be constructed with sturdier materials, like stone and iron, and with reinforced walls that could withstand the tremors of future earthquakes. The new designs also included wider streets and open spaces to prevent the rapid spread of fires, which had been one of the most devastating consequences of the previous disaster. In addition to the new architectural standards, the rebuilding process was also shaped by Pombal's desire to create a city that was more organized and accessible. The layout of the city was carefully planned, with large straight streets that allowed for better traffic flow and easier movement of people and goods. The reconstruction was not just about rebuilding what had been lost, but about creating a forward-thinking urban center that would stand as a symbol of recovery and resilience. The rebuilding efforts were not without challenges, however. The sheer scale of the destruction made it difficult to restore the city to its former glory, but through meticulous planning, efficient use of resources, and a determination to modernize, Lisbon began to take shape as a new city. By the end of the 1750s, Lisbon had risen from the ashes of the earthquake, emerging as a more resilient and forward-thinking city than it had been before the disaster. The Marquis de Pombal's leadership during this period left a lasting legacy on Lisbon, both in terms of its architecture and urban planning. The earthquake of 1755, while devastating, ultimately led to the transformation of Lisbon into a more modern, safer, and more resilient city. The recovery of Lisbon from the ruins of disaster is a testament to human strength and ingenuity, demonstrating that even in the face of unimaginable loss, the spirit of a city and its people can endure. The aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake reverberated far beyond the city's walls, leaving a lasting impact on both scientific research and cultural understanding. As one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, it not only changed the landscape of Lisbon, but also altered the way the world approached natural disasters. The tragedy of 1755 pushed advancements in seismic research and the development of earthquake-resistant building practices, setting the stage for future generations to better understand and mitigate the destructive power of earthquakes. The earthquake marked the beginning of a more systematic approach to studying earthquakes. In the years that followed, the scientific community began to explore new methods of understanding seismic activity. Theories of plate tectonics, developed centuries later, would trace their origins back to the desire to understand the causes of the Lisbon earthquake. As seismic monitoring techniques advanced, it became possible to predict and prepare for future events in a way that had never been possible before. Beyond the scientific impact, the Lisbon earthquake had a profound influence on art, literature, and philosophy. The tragedy became a central theme in works of literature, particularly in the writings of the Enlightenment thinkers who were profoundly affected by the event. Voltaire's work, Candide, was directly inspired by the earthquake, using it as a way to critique the philosophical optimism of the time. The earthquake also shaped the development of European thought, prompting a shift towards a more rational, evidence-based approaches to understanding the world. The visual arts, too, were shaped by the events of 1755. Paintings and engravings of the disaster depicted the destruction of Lisbon and its people's suffering, capturing the scale and human cost of the earthquake. These works helped to preserve the memory of the disaster and serve as a reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of nature's overwhelming power. Perhaps one of the most significant legacies of the Lisbon earthquake was the shift it caused in how people viewed the relationship between humans and the natural world. The destruction prompted a rethinking of religious interpretations, as well as a growing confidence in the ability of science and reason to explain the forces of nature. It was a turning point in history, where the old world views were challenged and the foundation for modern seismic science was laid. The earthquake's influence continues to be felt today, as it remains one of the most studied natural disasters in history. The lessons learned from the tragedy of 1755 have informed modern earthquake preparedness and building techniques, and the event has become a crucial part of both European history and the broader understanding of how natural disasters shape human society. The legacy of the Lisbon earthquake is not just about the destruction it caused, but also about the resilience, knowledge, and progress it inspired in its wake. It serves as a reminder that while nature's power is immense, humanity's capacity to adapt and rebuild is equally remarkable. The earthquake that struck Myanmar and Thailand on Friday, March 28, 2025, was one of the most devastating natural disasters in recent history. The powerful magnitude 7.7 quake shook the region, leaving behind widespread destruction, loss of life, and a humanitarian crisis that would take years to recover from. The epicenter of the quake was located near Mandalay, Myanmar's second largest city, a region already vulnerable due to its location along the Sagang Fault. This fault is a major tectonic boundary where the Indian and Eurasian plates grind against each other, making it one of the most seismically active areas in Southeast Asia. While scientists had long known that this area was at risk for a major earthquake, the sheer scale of the disaster was something that no one could have fully prepared for. As the ground began to shake around midday, panic spread across cities and towns. In Mandalay, centuries-old Buddhist monasteries crumbled, trapping monks and civilians beneath the rubble. A significant portion of the city was reduced to ruins, with an estimated 1/5 of buildings completely destroyed. In Myanmar, a town near the capital, Naypyidaw, dozens of buildings collapsed, including monasteries, where many lives were lost. The effects of the earthquake were not limited to Myanmar. In Thailand's capital, Bangkok, located over 600 miles from the epicenter. The tremors were powerful enough to send people running into the streets. A skyscraper under construction collapsed entirely, leading to multiple fatalities and trapping more than 100 people under debris. Hotels, office buildings, and homes shook violently, with some suffering structural damage that made them unsafe to enter. Beyond the visible destruction, the earthquake's impact on infrastructure was severe. Roads were torn apart by deep fissures, making it nearly impossible for emergency crews to reach affected areas quickly. Bridges collapsed, severing key transportation routes. In Naypyidaw, a 1,000-bed hospital suffered major structural damage, further complicating efforts to treat the wounded. The initial shock was followed by a powerful aftershock and several smaller ones, making rescue efforts even more dangerous. With communications down in many areas, the true extent of the damage was not immediately clear. Reports trickled in of entire villages suffering near total destruction, leaving thousands of people homeless overnight. In the hours following the earthquake, Myanmar's military leader, General Min Aung Hlaing, acknowledged the scale of the disaster, warning that the number of casualties would likely rise. He also made a rare appeal for international assistance, stating that any country willing to help was welcome to do so. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Donald Trump addressed the situation, confirming that his administration would provide aid to Myanmar. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, mobilized disaster response teams, offering emergency supplies such as food and clean water. Other countries began to follow suit, but the ongoing conflict in Myanmar complicated relief efforts. The military junta had been struggling to maintain control amid a growing insurgency, and the political instability made it difficult for aid organizations to operate effectively. In the immediate aftermath, search and rescue operations became the top priority. Volunteers and emergency workers raced against time to pull survivors from the wreckage. However, the lack of heavy machinery made the process painfully slow. Many survivors were left trapped under debris, their voices calling out for help as rescuers worked with limited resources. As the first chaotic hours passed, it became clear that this was a disaster unlike any other in recent memory. The people of Myanmar and Thailand were facing not only the destruction of their homes and cities, but also a long and difficult road to recovery. In the coming days, the focus will shift to providing food, water, and medical care to the survivors. But even as relief efforts ramped up, the challenges ahead remained immense. This was only the beginning of the devastating aftermath of the earthquake. In the hours following the earthquake, the full scale of the disaster began to emerge. Emergency response teams in Myanmar and Thailand struggled to navigate the widespread destruction, with blocked roads, damaged bridges, and collapsed buildings, making it difficult to reach those in need. The rescue effort was further complicated by the sheer number of aftershocks, some strong enough to bring down already weakened structures. As the sun set on Friday, March 28, 2025, entire neighborhoods in Mandalay, Myanmar, and surrounding areas remained in ruins, with thousands of people left homeless and desperate for help. Survivors described scenes of chaos and devastation. Many who had fled their homes were now gathered in open spaces, afraid to return indoors. Makeshift camps began to form in parks and fields as people tried to find shelter. Hospitals in Mandalay and other affected cities were overwhelmed, struggling to care for the injured as medical supplies dwindled. In some areas, doctors and nurses were forced to treat patients outside, using whatever resources were available. The earthquake's impact on infrastructure was severe. Power outages left much of Mandalay in darkness, with only emergency generators providing limited electricity. Telecommunications were heavily disrupted, making it difficult for families to check on their loved ones. In Myanmar, where a significant number of buildings had collapsed, rescue workers faced a heartbreaking reality. Many trapped victims could still be heard beneath the rubble, but the lack of proper equipment slowed efforts to reach them. Volunteers and first responders used their bare hands and simple tools to dig through the debris, knowing that time was running out. In Thailand, the destruction was most severe in Bangkok, where the collapse of a high-rise building had already claimed multiple lives. Emergency crews worked tirelessly to search for survivors in the wreckage, while others assessed the damage to surrounding structures. Authorities urged residents to avoid unsafe buildings, fearing further collapses. Despite the destruction, Thailand's emergency response teams were better equipped than those in Myanmar, and international aid began arriving quickly to assist in the relief efforts. As rescue operations continued, the political situation in Myanmar made the crisis even more difficult to manage. The country had already been struggling with instability, and the military leadership faced criticism for its slow response. The junta-controlled state media reported that at least 144 people had been killed, with over 700 injured, though experts feared the true numbers were much higher. Humanitarian organizations struggled to gain access to affected regions, as restrictions on movement and ongoing conflict made relief efforts increasingly complex. Meanwhile, scientists and earthquake experts analyzed the event, confirming that it had occurred along the Sagaing Fault, one of the most active seismic zones in Southeast Asia. The powerful strike-slip movement of the fault had caused intense shaking over a wide area, with damage extending far beyond the immediate epicenter. Seismologists warned that strong aftershocks could continue for days or even weeks, posing further risks to already damaged buildings. The disaster was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of the region to major earthquakes. While Thailand had better infrastructure and emergency preparedness, Myanmar's aging buildings and lack of earthquake-resistant construction had contributed to the high number of casualties. Experts noted that many structures in Mandalay, including monasteries and historical sites, had not been built to withstand such a powerful tremor. As night fell on the first day after the earthquake, the focus remained on saving lives. Rescue workers continued digging through rubble, medical teams treated the injured with limited supplies, and survivors braced for another night of uncertainty. The true extent of the disaster was still unfolding, and the long road to recovery only just begun. As it's only the early hours of the second day since the disaster, the enormity of the crisis became even clearer. Entire neighborhoods throughout the surrounding areas, cities, and towns were reduced to rubble, and the death toll continued to rise as more bodies were pulled from the debris. Emergency workers, many of whom had gone without sleep, pushed forward with rescue efforts despite the overwhelming conditions. The sound of sirens and frantic calls for help filled the air as volunteers and medical teams raced to save lives. Survivors faced worsening conditions as they struggled to find food, clean water, and medical care. The lack of electricity meant that refrigeration was impossible, causing food supplies to spoil quickly. Many were left with only what they had managed to grab before fleeing their homes. Local markets had been destroyed and supply chains were disrupted, making it difficult to bring in fresh goods. Relief organizations tried to set up distribution points, but with damaged roads and limited access, aid was slow to reach those in need. Temporary shelters sprang up in open fields and makeshift camps, where thousands of displaced people gathered in search of safety. These overcrowded conditions raised concerns about sanitation and the potential spread of disease. Without proper facilities, clean water, or medical supplies, illnesses such as diarrhea and respiratory infections began to take hold. Doctors and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide basic care, but the situation was growing worse by the hour. In Bangkok, efforts continued to clear the wreckage of the collapsed high-rise building, where rescuers feared dozens were still trapped. Heavy machinery was brought in to assist, but unstable debris made the work dangerous. Families gathered nearby, anxiously awaiting news of their loved ones. Officials warned that aftershocks could cause further collapses, urging residents to remain cautious. The Thai government had mobilized emergency response teams and was working with international partners to provide aid to affected areas. And back in Myanmar, the situation remained dire. The country's political instability complicated relief efforts, with reports of delayed government response and restrictions on foreign aid. Some areas remained completely cut off, with residents forced to rely on community efforts for survival. In Mandalay, religious leaders and local volunteers took the lead in organizing relief efforts, setting up food kitchens and providing temporary shelter in monasteries. International aid organizations struggled to navigate the political barriers, but some managed to deliver much-needed supplies. The United Nations and various humanitarian groups sent shipments of medical supplies, tents, and clean water to the region. The United States Agency for International Development, despite earlier funding cuts, announced that it would be sending disaster response teams to assist. However, logistical challenges made distribution difficult. with damaged roads and collapsed bridges delaying shipments. Seismologists continued to analyze the earthquake, warning that aftershocks could persist for weeks. Many buildings still standing had suffered structural damage, making them unsafe for residents to return. Experts noted that the Sagang Fault had experienced major quakes in the past, but this event was one of the most destructive in recent history. They stressed the need for improved building standards in the region to prevent future disasters from causing similar devastation. Meanwhile, stories of survival and heroism emerged. In one case, a man trapped beneath a collapsed apartment building in Myanmar was rescued after hours of being trapped. He had survived by drinking rainwater that seeped through the wreckage and tapping on metal pipes to signal rescuers. In another, a group of monks helped evacuate dozens of people from a monastery, just minutes before it collapsed. These stories provided moments of hope amid the overwhelming tragedy. As night approached, thousands remained without shelter, and the need for aid grew even more urgent. The region faced a long and difficult recovery, with countless families left grieving and entire communities struggling to rebuild. The days ahead will bring new challenges, but for now, the focus remains on rescuing those still trapped and providing relief to the survivors who had lost everything. In the 9 hours since the powerful earthquake struck Myanmar and Thailand, the region has been thrown into chaos. Rescue operations are still in full force, with emergency teams working tirelessly to pull survivors from the rubble. As the hours pass, the urgency grows. Every minute counts in the search for those still trapped. The damage is extensive, with entire sections of cities reduced to ruins. Streets are filled with dust and debris, making it difficult for rescue vehicles to navigate through the wreckage. In Mandalay, where the destruction is among the worst, emergency workers are struggling to reach people buried beneath collapsed apartment buildings. The sound of heavy machinery fills the air as crews work to clear the debris, but for many, all they can do is wait. Survivors and volunteers have joined the rescue effort, using whatever tools they can find to dig through the wreckage. Some trapped individuals have managed to make contact with rescuers through phone calls or by shouting for help, but many remain silent, their fate unknown. Hospitals are overwhelmed, with doctors and nurses working beyond capacity to treat the injured. Many medical facilities sustained damage in the quake, forcing staff to set up makeshift treatment areas in parking lots and open spaces. Supplies are already running low, and with aftershocks continuing to shake the region, the fear of further collapses is keeping both patients and medical workers on edge. In some areas, the injured are being transported by motorcycles and bicycles due to roads being blocked by fallen buildings. In Bangkok, emergency crews continue to search through the ruins of the collapsed high-rise building. The structure, once a towering landmark under construction, is now a massive pile of twisted metal and broken concrete. Dozens of workers were inside when the quake hit, and authorities fear that many did not make it out in time. Relatives of those trapped are gathered nearby, waiting anxiously for any news. Officials have confirmed fatalities, but with so many still unaccounted for, the full toll remains uncertain. Across the region, thousands have been left homeless, forced to sleep in open spaces or makeshift shelters as they wait for assistance. Food and clean water are already becoming scarce, and the risk of disease is growing as sanitation systems have been severely damaged. Aid organizations and government agencies are scrambling to respond, but the scale of the disaster is making relief efforts difficult. Political tensions in Myanmar are adding another layer of complexity to the situation. The military junta has issued statements calling for international aid, but our access to affected areas remains restricted. Some regions are still cut off entirely, with no clear picture of the damage or the number of casualties. The lack of communication and coordination is slowing down rescue and relief efforts, leaving many to fend for themselves. As night falls, power outages have left entire cities in darkness. The only sources of light come from fires burning in the rubble and the flashlights of rescue teams still searching for survivors. The coming hours will be critical. Rescuers know that the chances of survival decrease with every passing moment. With limited resources and an enormous task ahead, the people of Myanmar and Thailand are facing one of the most challenging nights in their history. On March 11, 2011, Japan experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in its history, the Tohoku earthquake. Measuring a staggering 9.0 on the Richter scale, this earthquake was the strongest ever recorded in Japan. It struck off the eastern coast deep under the Pacific Ocean, with the epicenter located about 70 miles east of the city of Sendai. The massive quake occurred at around 2:46 p.m. local time and lasted for several minutes, shaking the entire island of Honshu. The tremors from the earthquake were felt across the country, with buildings swaying in the capital, Tokyo, and the surrounding areas. But the earthquake wasn't just a terrifying moment for the people of Japan, it set off a chain of catastrophic events. The shaking of the earth caused enormous damage, and the ground itself was displaced. In fact, the Tohoku earthquake was so powerful that it caused the island of Honshu to shift eastward by about 8 feet. The land movement was so intense that it even affected the Earth's rotation, shortening the length of a day by a fraction of a second. The immediate destruction caused by the earthquake was overwhelming. Buildings collapsed, roads cracked open, and entire communities were left in ruins. Infrastructure was severely damaged, including railways, bridges, and power lines, leaving many areas without electricity, water, and communication. But as if the earthquake itself wasn't enough, it triggered something even more destructive: the tsunami. Within minutes of the earthquake, the sea began to rise. Waves, some reaching heights of up to 130 feet, surged across the coastline. The tsunami slammed into the eastern shores of Japan, moving at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, faster than a commercial jet. Entire towns and villages were swept away in seconds, as the relentless force of the ocean drowned homes, vehicles, and buildings. It wasn't just the size of the waves that caused the destruction, it was the sheer speed and power behind them. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the death toll began to rise rapidly. In addition to the overwhelming destruction, the tsunami also caused a massive environmental impact. The powerful waves flooded fields, forests, and rivers, turning once thriving ecosystems into disaster zones. The aftermath left behind a landscape of devastation, and the cleanup and recovery efforts would take years. Even more alarming was the damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The tsunami crippled the facility, knocking out backup generators and leading to meltdowns in several reactors. This sparked an international nuclear crisis as the world watched in horror, unsure of how far the contamination would spread. The scale of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami left the country reeling. It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a life-altering event that shook the very foundation of Japan. Survivors would soon face unimaginable challenges as they dealt with the immediate aftermath. The destruction was just the beginning. The first few hours after the Tohoku earthquake were filled with chaos and confusion. As aftershocks continued to rattle the country, it quickly became clear that the scale of the destruction was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Communication lines were down, and power outages affected millions. Many people found themselves trapped under rubble, while others scrambled to find shelter and basic necessities. Rescue operations were immediately put into action, but the damage was so widespread that it was difficult to know where to start. In the hardest hit areas, such as Sendai and other towns in the northeast, entire neighborhoods had been wiped out by the tsunami. In some cases, there was nothing left but a sea of debris. Families had lost homes, loved ones, and their entire livelihoods in a matter of hours. Emergency response teams, both local and international, faced incredible challenges in trying to locate survivors, often working in unsafe and difficult conditions. The destruction of roads, bridges, and airports made it nearly impossible to reach the worst affected areas quickly, and search and rescue teams had to rely on boats and helicopters to carry out their operations. The devastation also left the Japanese government scrambling to coordinate efforts on a massive scale. Within the first day, it became clear that the damage was beyond what anyone had imagined. The focus shifted from immediate rescue to managing the crisis and beginning the recovery process. Thousands of people were displaced, living in temporary shelters, with limited access to food, water, and medical care. The government quickly declared a state of emergency and sent troops and aid workers to help with the relief efforts. Meanwhile, the tsunami's impact was still unfolding. The relentless surge of water had left thousands of people stranded, especially in coastal towns and fishing villages, where the waves had come in so fast that there was no time for evacuation. In some places, the water had pushed inland for miles, leaving behind flooded fields, destroyed homes, and overturned cars. Survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, but many didn't know where to begin. The loss of life was unimaginable, and the trauma of seeing everything they knew and loved swept away was overwhelming. As the death toll continued to climb, there was a desperate need for medical care. Hospitals were inundated with injured patients, and doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. Despite the overwhelming number of casualties, many hospitals were also affected by the earthquake and tsunami, and some had to relocate or operate under extremely difficult circumstances. The shortage of medical supplies was another hurdle. with medical teams relying on emergency stockpiles and aid from the international community to treat the injured. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster was also an escalating crisis that added to the complexity of the situation. As the plant's reactors overheated, a radioactive leak began to contaminate the air, water, and soil around the facility. The government had to quickly evacuate people within a 12-mile radius of the plant, and there were growing concerns about the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The threat of contamination extended beyond Japan's borders, with neighboring countries and the global community watching closely as the situation developed. The disaster sparked a renewed debate about the safety of nuclear power and whether Japan's reliance on nuclear energy was sustainable in such a disaster-prone region. In the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, Japan's disaster preparedness was put to the ultimate test. The country had always been well known for its building standards and readiness for natural disasters, but this catastrophe showed that no level of preparation could fully anticipate the scale of such a destructive event. While Japan's response was swift, the scale of the disaster was so large that it overwhelmed even the best-laid plans. It was clear that the nation was going to need all the help it could get from the international community to recover. As the days turned into weeks after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, the challenges facing Japan only grew more complex. The immediate aftermath had seen some rescue operations begin to yield positive results, but now the focus had shifted to the long-term effects of the disaster and the grueling task of rebuilding. With over 15,000 lives lost and many more still missing, the country was beginning to grapple with the full extent of the tragedy. Whole towns had been completely wiped off the map, and the sheer scale of the damage seemed impossible to comprehend. The tsunami had swept through coastal towns with such force that entire communities were gone in an instant. In many of these places, there was nothing left but debris and wreckage, and people were left wondering how they could rebuild their lives when everything had been lost. Temporary shelters had been set up across the country, but with millions displaced, it became apparent that Japan was facing a logistical nightmare in terms of providing adequate shelter, food, water, and medical care. The number of survivors was still being assessed, and many had been forced to live in makeshift shelters with no idea when or if they could return home. In addition to the physical destruction, the emotional toll on survivors was immeasurable. Communities were left to cope with the loss of loved ones, friends, and neighbors. For many, the trauma of the event was compounded by the uncertainty about their future. People were desperate for information about where they could go, how they could find their missing family members, and what would become of the homes and businesses that had once been their livelihoods. The recovery process was hindered by continued aftershocks and the ever-present risk of further seismic activity. Even as efforts were made to stabilize the situation and restore order, Japan's infrastructure remained under immense strain. Roads, railways, and airports had been severely damaged, making it difficult to transport aid to those in need. The logistical challenges of rebuilding were further compounded by the fact that many affected areas were in remote locations, requiring teams to work in hazardous conditions to begin the process of clearing debris and making the land safe again. Meanwhile, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear crisis was escalating. The plant's reactors were still overheating, and the threat of a nuclear meltdown loomed large. Over the weeks that followed, the Japanese government had to continue evacuating residents from the surrounding areas as it worked to bring the reactors under control. The public's fear and uncertainty about the long-term health effects of radiation exposure was palpable as people struggled to comprehend the full impact of the crisis. International organizations and experts closely monitored the situation as the global community watched to see if the situation could be contained. The environmental impact of the disaster was far-reaching as well. Coastal ecosystems had been decimated by the powerful waves, and the destruction of habitats had long-term consequences for marine life. In some areas, the destruction was so severe that efforts to restore the environment would take years, if not decades. The contamination of water supplies also raised concerns about the long-term health risks to both humans and wildlife. In the midst of all this destruction, the spirit of resilience and cooperation in Japan became evident. Communities that had been torn apart by the disaster began to come together to support each other. Volunteers from across the country, as well as from other nations, arrived to help with the recovery efforts. Though the task ahead seemed impossible, people were determined to rebuild and move forward. While the physical and emotional scars left by the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami would remain for years to come, Japan's strength and resolve were visible in the faces of those who were working tirelessly to help each other and rebuild their communities. The government, too, was working around the clock to address the needs of the people and coordinate efforts with international organizations. Aid was being funneled into the hardest hit areas, and as the weeks passed, there was a glimmer of hope that recovery would one day be possible, even if the road ahead was long and uncertain. Despite all the devastation, Japan's ability to unite and push forward in the face of unimaginable loss was truly remarkable. Months passed after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and Japan's recovery began to take shape, though the process was slow and fraught with challenges. As the immediate crisis started to settle, the true scope of the disaster's long-term effects on the country's infrastructure, economy, and society became more apparent. Reconstruction was an overwhelming task, but the people of Japan, known for their resilience, were not backing down. The nation was determined to rise from the ashes of the catastrophe and rebuild stronger than before, but it would take time. The scale of the destruction continued to unfold as teams of engineers, construction workers, and volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild roads, homes, schools, and businesses. However, much of Japan's infrastructure had been completely wiped out, leaving vast areas uninhabitable. Some towns, once thriving communities, were now ghost towns. Many citizens faced the harsh reality that their homes were gone and they had nowhere to return to. For those who had been displaced, living in temporary shelters for months became a way of life. Even with the help of international aid and volunteers, the sheer amount of debris that needed to be cleared was staggering. Heavy machinery worked day and night to make roads passable again, while thousands of tons of wreckage were removed from the affected areas. One of the greatest challenges in the recovery process was the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. While the earthquake and tsunami had caused widespread damage, the nuclear crisis had the potential for far-reaching consequences. The plant had suffered catastrophic damage, and the reactors had begun leaking radiation. Despite efforts by plant workers to prevent a full meltdown, the situation remained tense for months after the disaster. Thousands of residents in the area had been evacuated, with no clear idea of when they could safely return home. The radioactive contamination was a real threat, and the Japanese government faced enormous pressure to contain the disaster. Over time, efforts to stabilize the reactors progressed, but the impact of the meltdown on both the environment and public health was only beginning to be understood. As time went on, the economic fallout from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami also became more pronounced. The damage to Japan's industrial sector was severe, and the country faced significant losses in its manufacturing industries. Many factories, especially those in the hardest hit regions, had to shut down indefinitely. Even industries outside the immediate impact zone felt the repercussions as disruptions to the supply chain caused by the disaster spread throughout the country. The nation's economy had already been fragile due to prior challenges, and the earthquake and tsunami added another layer of strain. It was clear that recovery wouldn't just be about rebuilding homes and businesses. It would also require significant effort to revitalize the economy and restore livelihoods. The environmental impact was another lingering concern. In addition to the devastation caused by the tsunami, the contamination of soil and water from the Fukushima nuclear disaster posed significant challenges for agriculture and fishing industries. Farmers in affected areas faced crop failures due to the destruction of land and the spread of radioactive material. Fishers, too, found their livelihoods threatened as radiation-tainted waters affected the fishing industry. Many coastal towns had to halt their fishing activities for months, and restoring the health of marine ecosystems would take years. The environmental recovery process was a slow one, requiring efforts to clean up contaminated areas and ensure that people could return to a healthy, sustainable way of life. Though the immediate aftermath of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami was devastating, Japan began to heal over time. The global community continued to offer support, and international organizations worked closely with the Japanese government to provide aid and expertise in the recovery efforts. The emotional toll on survivors, however, was deep. Many had lost loved ones, homes, and entire communities, and the process of healing was just beginning. Mental health support became a critical aspect of the recovery efforts, with survivors being encouraged to seek counseling and community support to cope with the trauma they had experienced. Japan's commitment to its recovery was unwavering. Over the months, as rebuilding efforts gained momentum, the country's sense of unity and resilience became even more apparent. Communities that had once been torn apart were now coming together to support each other. Volunteers continued to arrive from across Japan and beyond, offering assistance in every form imaginable. Despite the long road ahead, Japan had taken its first steps toward recovery, and the people showed the world that their spirit would not be broken by even the most devastating of disasters. As the years went on, the recovery from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami continued. Though the scars of that fateful day would remain for a long time, the physical destruction caused by the disaster was gradually repaired. But the emotional and psychological toll it took on Japan's citizens was something that could not be rebuilt in the same way. Survivors were left with memories of loss and fear, memories that would linger long after the debris was cleared. For many, the recovery process became about more than just rebuilding homes or cities. It was about rebuilding lives. In the aftermath, Japan made important strides in disaster preparedness and safety. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami were grim reminders of the vulnerabilities the country faced, and the nation took these lessons seriously. Japan implemented stricter building codes and disaster response protocols, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to handle any kind of natural disaster. Early warning systems were improved, and emergency drills became more frequent, with both citizens and officials learning how to respond more effectively in times of crisis. Internationally, the Tohoku disaster prompted a re-evaluation of nuclear energy and its safety. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster led to a widespread reassessment of nuclear power plants around the world, and many countries began to reconsider their reliance on nuclear energy. Japan, too, faced tough decisions regarding its nuclear future. While some reactors were shut down, the country made efforts to shift towards renewable energy sources in a bid to reduce its dependence on nuclear power and fossil fuels. The global conversation about the risks and benefits of nuclear energy became more urgent, and many nations reconsidered their energy strategies as a result. The environmental recovery from the Tohoku disaster was a long and difficult process. The Fukushima nuclear disaster had left a lasting mark on Japan's landscape, with certain areas remaining uninhabitable due to radiation contamination. While the cleanup efforts were ongoing, the country's commitment to restoring its environment remained steadfast. Local ecosystems, especially in coastal areas, began to show signs of recovery, though some species of marine life still face challenges due to the contamination. Over time, efforts to restore damaged ecosystems and promote sustainable practices gained momentum. The emotional impact of the disaster also left a profound mark on Japan's culture and psyche. Families who had lost loved ones found solace in their shared experiences, and many people felt a renewed sense of community as they came together to help each other. The disaster had brought out the best in people, with volunteers from around Japan and the world coming to support those in need. Despite the immense pain, the Japanese people demonstrated extraordinary resilience, showing the world that even in the face of such overwhelming loss, hope could still flourish. In the end, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami served as a reminder of nature's immense power and the importance of preparation. The disaster tested Japan's strength, but it also highlighted the unbreakable spirit of its people. While the immediate impact of the disaster was devastating, the response to it revealed a nation committed to learning from tragedy and building a more resilient future. Though the wounds from that day may never fully heal, Japan's recovery demonstrated the strength of human perseverance and the power of unity in the face of disaster.